My father kicked me out at 18 and fully funded my brother's life, ignoring me completely. 10 years later, I bought their house. What happens next will leave you speechless. I was 18 when my father told me to leave. The words came out of his mouth like a sentence, not a suggestion, and I knew before he even finished speaking that there would be no room for discussion. He stood in the hallway of the house I had called home for as long as I could remember, the air heavy with the smell of his aftershave and the faint dust of the old carpet. He wasn't leaning, wasn't fidgeting. He stood tall, hands folded behind his back as if this was some business deal he was conducting, not the end of his son's place in his home. His voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It was flat, almost rehearsed as he said, "You're grown now. It's time you stand on your own 2 feet. That was it. Nothing more. No explanation, no fatherly advice, no reassurance. Just the quiet cruelty of finality. I remember staring at his face, trying to find even a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But his jaw was set, his brow unwrinkled, his gaze sharp and unblinking. He had already made this decision long before speaking it aloud, and I realized in that moment that my reaction wouldn't change a thing. Beside him, on the floor, was my suitcase. I had packed it the night before, not because I wanted to, but because he had ordered me to. "Put your things together," he had said the previous evening. His tone as casual as if he were asking me to take out the trash. I remember lying awake most of that night, staring at the shadows on my bedroom ceiling, trying to imagine what life would look like in less than 24 hours. The walls of that room had once been covered in posters, trophies, and the childish drawings I never had the courage to take down. Packing my clothes into that suitcase had felt like tearing pages from a book I wasn't finished reading. Now, in the hallway, it sat zipped shut, waiting for me to pick it up and leave. My father didn't touch it, didn't offer to help. He simply nodded toward it with his chin, like a man dismissing a hired hand after a long shift. Behind him, I noticed movement on the staircase. My younger brother, Daniel, stood halfway up, one hand on the railing, the other resting against the wall. He was 16 then, still under the shield of youth, still tucked comfortably under my father's wing. His face carried a look of unease, his eyes darting between me and our father, as though he didn't quite know which expression to copy. His mouth opened, just slightly, like he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Instead, he leaned back against the railing, silent, watching. I bent down, picked up the handle of my suitcase, and felt its weight pull against my arm. It wasn't heavy in size, but the moment pressed down on me until every step toward the front door felt like I was dragging the entire house behind me. My sneakers squeaked faintly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness of the hallway. My father stayed rooted in place, arms folded now, staring as if this was simply routine. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning with a sound I had heard countless times before but now seemed sharper, more final. The cool evening air drifted in, carrying with it the distant hum of crickets and the faint smell of cut grass. I stepped out onto the porch, my chest tight, my breath uneven. For a moment I didn't look back. I wanted to keep walking, to spare myself the pain of seeing what I already knew I'd lost. But something tugged at me, a small, bitter instinct that said, "Look, just once more." So I turned. That was when I saw it. My father, still standing tall in the hallway, had pulled out his wallet. He didn't notice my gaze lingering, or maybe he didn't care. His fingers slipped inside the worn leather, pulling out a stack of bills, thick, folded, unmistakably more than pocket money. He extended his hand toward Daniel, who had descended a step closer, and without a word, placed the money in his palm. Daniel's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and gratitude, his shoulders straightening as though he had just been crowned with some invisible honor. It wasn't a gift, it was a message. A quiet declaration that one son was worth investing in, and the other was worth discarding. The sting hit me then, sharper than the command to leave had ever been. Until that moment, I had told myself that maybe this was just some twisted lesson my father thought I needed to learn, that by pushing me out, he believed he was forcing me to grow. But the sight of his money in Daniel's hand shattered that illusion. It wasn't about teaching me responsibility. It was about preference. About love measured not in words or care, but in bills handed to the child he favored. I stood frozen on the porch, suitcase at my side, staring at the scene as though I were watching the closing act of a play I hadn't agreed to be in. Daniel's gaze lifted toward me again. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked. I saw confusion in him, yes, but I also saw relief. Relief that it wasn't him standing where I was, suitcase in hand, about to be cut from the story of our family. His lips pressed together, and he shifted uncomfortably, like a boy caught between guilt and gratitude. I turned back toward the yard, unable to stand the sight any longer. The gravel crunch under my shoes as I walked to my car felt louder than the world should allow. I opened the door, slid inside, and set the suitcase on the passenger seat. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the house where the lights glowed warmly against the night. Inside that house, life would go on as though I had never existed. Dinner would be served, laughter would rise, and my absence would leave no empty chair. That night I didn't drive far. Just down the road, behind the gas station with its buzzing neon sign, I parked. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and fried food from the convenience store inside. I leaned back in the seat, staring up through the windshield at the ceiling of the sky, painted with faint stars barely visible through the glow of the town's lights. I wasn't angry, not then. Anger requires heat, and I was empty, hollow in a way I had never known before. The kind of hollow that comes not from loss, but from the slow realization that what you thought you had might never have been yours at all. My chest felt heavy, like every breath had to push against stones. Memories crept in uninvited, filling the silence. I saw myself at 10 years old, sitting at the dinner table, holding up a report card covered in A's, waiting for my father's praise. All I got was a nod and the words, "Good. Next time, do better." I remembered Daniel, 2 years younger, stumbling through a baseball game, missing every swing. My father had clapped him on the back anyway, laughing, saying, "That's my boy." I thought of the time I broke my arm playing football in the yard, how the pain had throbbed up my arm like fire, and how my father scolded me for being careless before leaving to drive Daniel to practice. Every memory rearranged itself in my mind, falling into place like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see. Now I understood the picture. The truth was simple, brutal, and undeniable. My father loved Daniel enough to carry him, to protect him, to invest in him. And he loved me only enough to cut me loose. And that night, as I lay in the back seat of my car, the hum of traffic far away and the ache of betrayal close in my chest, I whispered the thought to myself as if saying it aloud would make me believe it. My father loved my brother enough to carry him, but he loved me only enough to cut me loose. I spent the next years learning how to live without help. The first nights were the hardest. Cold floors in strangers' basements, the faint smell of mold in garages where I stretched out on a thin mattress, the cramped seat of a car that shook when trucks passed on the highway. My hands became my only wealth. They blistered, cracked, and bled on construction sites where foremen shouted over the noise of drills and hammers. By the time I was 20, the skin on my palms had hardened like leather, proof that no one else would carry me forward. Each day ended the same way. Me sitting alone, silent, ignored by the men I worked beside, my name forgotten as soon as the shift ended. But in every place I worked, in every face I studied, I carried something with me. Not bitterness, but observation. I learned how men held on to power. The bosses with fat wallets and silver watches who never lifted a hand to labor. They weren't stronger than us, they were simply smarter. They controlled the flow of money, the rules of the game, the gates that kept the rest of us scrambling outside. My father had taught me something without meaning to, what it felt like to stand on the outside looking in. And I promised myself I would never stand there again. Daniel, meanwhile, was lifted higher every year. I didn't need to see it with my own eyes to know. News traveled in whispers at family gatherings I was never invited to, through cousins who slipped me bits of conversation. Sometimes Daniel himself called, never to ask how I was, never to reach out as a brother should, but to brag. I remember one call in particular. I was 21, sitting on the curb outside a mechanic's shop where I had spent the day covered in grease, and my phone buzzed. Guess what? Daniel's voice was smug, bright, brimming with self-satisfaction. Dad bought me a car. Not new but close. Graduation gift. Leather seats, Bluetooth, the whole thing. I looked at my hands, blackened with oil, fingernails torn and stained. My chest tightened, but I kept my tone even. That's good, Daniel. Take care of it. He laughed through the phone, careless and easy. Don't worry. If something happens, Dad will help me out. Then he hung up without even asking what I was driving, or if I had eaten that day. Moments like that burned, but I didn't let the fire consume me. I let it shrink into a coal, glowing steady, never extinguished. I knew flames would scorch me more than him, so I kept it hidden, feeding it only with patience. My plan, though I couldn't see its full shape yet, wasn't to fight in anger. It was to wait, to learn, and to build something so solid they could never knock it down. Flashbacks haunted me when the nights stretched too long. I would close my eyes and hear the clink of silverware at the dinner table, see Daniel boasting about catching a ball or getting a B on a test, and hear my father's deep laugh, his hands slapping Daniel's back like he was the pride of the family. Then the memory would shift. I would see myself, a boy holding up a report card lined with straight A's, my smile uncertain, waiting for approval. My father's face always came back blank. His voice clipped. Good. Next time, do better. The way he said it stung more than any insult could. It wasn't disappointment, it was indifference. Those memories cut like glass, but over time they sharpened me instead of breaking me. They taught me the truth that effort alone didn't win affection, and excellence didn't guarantee recognition. Favoritism was the currency my father dealt in, and Daniel had always been rich in it. Once I understood that, I stopped chasing scraps from a table I was never meant to sit at. Instead, I started drawing my own map, one that led far away from theirs. So I worked. I read when I could, taking books left behind in coffee shops, worn manuals from library bins, anything that would teach me something new. I saved every dollar I could scrape together. While Daniel spent freely, fueled by the money my father funneled his way, I stacked my earnings quietly. Dollar by dollar, I built something invisible but real, the foundation of a future they would never imagine I could have. At 22, I started a small repair service. It wasn't grand, just fixing broken fences, patching roofs, cleaning up after floods. The kind of jobs no one else wanted to touch. I remember one old man who paid me $30 to clear debris from his backyard after a storm. No one else showed up, he muttered, his voice trembling with age. I showed up, and each time I did, I learned how to turn sweat into stability. By 24, I had a truck with my name stenciled on the side. By 26, I had 3 men working under me. Their faces carried the same tired lines mine once did. But they looked at me differently than I had ever been looked at before. Not as disposable, but as someone worth following. Stability turned into growth, and growth into something close to power. But still, the whispers reached me. Daniel graduated debt-free. Dad covered everything. Daniel moved into a nice apartment. Dad gave him the down payment. Each word was another reminder of the wall between us. Yet I didn't curse it. I measured it brick by brick, studying the fortress my father built around Daniel. And in those silent observations, I realized something. Fortresses don't last. They rot from the inside if the man behind them never learns to stand alone. Sometimes, when work was quiet, I would imagine Daniel's future. I saw him with shiny cars he didn't earn, houses he didn't build, clothes he didn't pay for. And then I imagined what would happen when the hand that fed him was gone. Would he know how to survive? Would he know how to climb without a ladder built by someone else? The answer always came back the same, no. He was being carried, not taught. And men who are carried never learn to walk. I carried these thoughts with a quiet resolve. They weren't weapons yet, but they were seeds. Seeds that would one day grow into something Daniel and my father could not ignore. For now, I kept my head low, my eyes forward, my coal of patience glowing steady in the dark. And while they believed I was still wandering, still forgotten, I was building a quiet foundation that one day would be strong enough to carry me further than either of them imagined. 10 years passed before I saw the house again. The sight of it struck me like a memory I wasn't ready to face. It looked smaller than the fortress it had seemed when I was 18. The white paint on the siding had dulled to a pale gray, peeling in long strips that fluttered whenever the wind caught them. The lawn was tired, more dirt than grass, patches of weeds clawing through where once it had been neatly trimmed. Even the porch seemed weary, its boards warped and cracked. Time had gnawed at the place, stripping it of the pride it once carried. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. My father, too, was older now. I saw him from across the street one afternoon, leaning against the mailbox, his back slightly bent, his movements slower, more deliberate. His pride, the thing that had once filled rooms and left no space for anyone else, had dulled like the paint on the siding. Daniel still lived with him, of course. That much I had already heard from whispers carried through family, and every whisper came with the same story. Daniel had failed at jobs too many times to count, had burned through money like water, had leaned on my father with the blind certainty of a man who never learned to stand alone. And yet my father gave, and still forgave. They were locked in a cycle neither of them could escape, because neither of them wanted to. And then came the notice. The house, the symbol of everything I had lost, was on the market. I didn't hesitate. The decision came as naturally as breathing. I bought it, not in my name, but through a company I had built and hidden beneath layers of paperwork. The deal was quiet, efficient, clean. Paper signed, money transferred, deed delivered. While they imagined a stranger would take it, I was already tightening the final knot in a plan I had been weaving for years. I didn't need to show my face at a closing table. I didn't need anyone to know. I only needed to wait for the letter that would tell them their home belonged to someone else. The day I knew it was done, I stood with the deed in my hands, staring at the ink that proved it. My name, written clear at the bottom, was a truth only I knew. And with it came a weight I had carried for a decade shifting off my shoulders, falling exactly where it belonged. A week later I visited. I didn't call. I didn't warn them. I drove up the familiar street, gravel crunching beneath my tires, and pulled into the same driveway where I had parked as a boy. The air smelled of damp leaves and smoke from a neighbor's chimney. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the front door. The memory of the night I was cast out pressed against me like a ghost. Then I stepped out, smoothed my jacket, and walked up the porch steps. When the door opened, it was my father standing there. His eyes, once sharp and hard, flickered with surprise when they landed on me. The silence stretched for a moment before he found his voice. "What are you doing here?" His tone carried the same edge of command it always had, but weaker now, softened by age and weariness. I didn't answer right away. I let my eyes wander past him, into the hallway I had once been pushed through, suitcase in hand. It smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that clings when years pass without care. Behind him, the house seemed smaller, dimmer. Daniel was slouched on the couch in the living room, half watching a muted television. His body hadn't changed much. Still lazy, still loose, like he had been waiting all his life for something to fall into his lap. He glanced up, saw me, and frowned. "Why's he here?" he asked, his voice sluggish, as though the very act of speaking was work. I stepped inside, crossing the same threshold I had once crossed in exile. My footsteps were slow, deliberate. "I need to talk to you both," I said quietly. My father's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't stop me. He closed the door behind me, the latch clicking shut with a sound that reminded me too much of the night I left. The living room felt smaller than I remembered. The curtains sagged, the carpet was stained, the furniture old and sunken. It wasn't the proud home it had once been. It was a shell. Daniel leaned forward, squinting at me, his brows knitting. "You didn't answer my question," he muttered. I looked at him, then at my father, whose hands were clasped tightly in front of him, veins visible against his thin skin. Slowly, I pulled a folded sheet of paper from my jacket pocket and held it out. My father took it, suspicion lining his face, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page. Once, twice. The disbelief crept over his features slowly, like dawn rising over a horizon. His lips parted, but no words came. His chest rose and fell, shallow, unsteady. Daniel stood, snatching the paper from his hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sharper now. His eyes darted across the page, his confusion twisting into something else. No, this can't be right." "It's right," I said, my voice calm. I felt no need to raise it. "This house is mine now." Daniel's eyes lifted from the page wide, his mouth opening like he was about to protest, but no words came. He turned to my father, who was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not authority, but something close to defeat. "You?" My father's voice cracked slightly before he steadied it. "You bought it?" "Yes." I didn't blink. "Quietly, through my company. It belongs to me." The silence that followed pressed down like weight on the room. Daniel sank back into the couch, the paper crumpling in his fist. "But why?" he whispered, though it sounded more like a plea than a question. I looked at both of them, the men who had defined my past, who had shaped my wounds. I felt no joy, no gloating satisfaction. Only the steady certainty of balance restored. "Because 10 years ago you decided I didn't belong here," I said. "Now I decide who does." Daniel shook his head, muttering under his breath, but the words tangled into nothing. My father lowered himself into the old armchair, his body sinking as though the truth had stolen what strength remained in him. He stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his breath uneven. I stayed standing, my presence filling the room in a way it never had when I was 18. My voice didn't waver as I finished. "You can stay a while, but only until I decide otherwise." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. It was the weight of 10 years shifting, finally landing where it belonged. I let them stay in the house for 3 more months. Those months were not a kindness, not truly, they were a mirror. Every morning when my father shuffled into the kitchen, he no longer walked with the same authority. He sat at the table with his coffee, staring at bills he knew weren't his to pay anymore. The house he once ruled over had slipped from his grasp, and though he stayed in it, the weight of ownership no longer belonged to him. I could see it in his eyes. He felt like a guest in the walls he had called his own. Daniel, too, felt it, though he tried to cover it with his lazy slouching and careless smirks. But even he couldn't hide the way his shoulders stiffened when I came through the door. I paid the bills they had ignored. Electricity, water, taxes, all the things they had let slide for months while they lived in comfort they hadn't earned. I fixed the leaks in the roof they had neglected, replaced the boards on the porch that had been left to rot. My hands, once forced to labor for strangers, now repaired the very place that had cast me out. Every nail I hammered, every pipe I tightened, was a quiet declaration. This was mine now, not theirs. And I wanted them to feel that truth with every flick of a light switch, with every drip that no longer echoed in the silence of the house. I didn't argue with them. I didn't demand apologies. Words would have been wasted. What could they say that would erase what had been done? Instead, I let the silence teach them. At night, I would hear Daniel muttering in the living room, his voice low, restless. Sometimes he spoke to my father, sometimes just to himself. "He thinks he's better than us," he whispered once, though his voice trembled. My father rarely answered. He sat quiet, his eyes heavy, his breath slow, as if the fight in him had finally drained away. I made the rules clear early on. "This house no longer belongs to you," I told them the first week, standing in the kitchen where I had once been scolded for spilling milk as a child. My voice was steady, not cruel. "You can live here for now. But the life you believed was secured, by favoritism, by money that was never earned, that life is over." Daniel's face twisted with disbelief, but my father only looked down at his hands. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Watching them live under my ownership wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was justice, the kind of justice that doesn't roar, but hums low and steady, felt in every corner of the room. They woke each morning in a place that no longer answered to their name. That was the lesson. That was the balance I wanted restored. When the day finally came, I asked them to leave. It was late afternoon, the sky painted with streaks of orange and gray. I stood in the doorway, the same doorway I had once been forced to cross with a suitcase in my hand, and looked at them as they packed. My father moved slowly, his hands folding clothes into a worn bag, his eyes never lifting to meet mine. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. Perhaps he knew he had no right to. Perhaps he finally understood what it felt like to be powerless in a place you once claimed as your own. Daniel, on the other hand, muttered under his breath as he stuffed belongings into boxes. "This is betrayal," he said once, his voice sharp, his eyes flashing toward me. "You don't do this to family." I didn't flinch. I didn't even answer. Betrayal was the ground I had walked on since the night I was 18. To hear the word now from his lips was almost laughable, but I wasn't there to laugh. I was there to watch, to let him taste the bitter thing I had swallowed for years. I stood still as they carried their things out. The scrape of boxes against the floor, the thud of footsteps on the porch, the creak of the screen door. It all sounded like echoes of a scene I had once lived. Only the roles were reversed. 10 years ago, I was the one stepping out into nothing, the weight of exile pressing on my shoulders. Now it was them. The difference was clear. I had walked into emptiness and built something from it. They were walking into the result of everything they had sown: dependency, decay, and failure. When the last box was gone, I stood in the doorway long after they had left. The silence inside the house felt heavier than any crowd. The rooms were empty now, stripped of the noise of their voices, but filled with ghosts of memory. I could see myself at 12, sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, trying to show my father a drawing I had made. I could hear Daniel laughing upstairs, calling out for our father, who would always go to him first. I could feel the sting of the night I was cast out, the slam of the door behind me. The memories pressed against me from every wall, both the good and the cruel. And yet, for the first time, I didn't feel small inside them. I felt steady. My footsteps echoed across the floors as I moved from room to room, touching the walls, tracing the edges of windows, as though reclaiming them with my presence. I paused in the living room, the same place Daniel had lounged for years, waiting for life to hand him something he hadn't earned. I lowered myself onto the couch, the fabric worn and sagging beneath me, and sat in silence. My chest rose and fell slowly, evenly. This wasn't about celebration. This wasn't about revenge in the way most men imagined it, with shouting, with flames, with destruction. My revenge was different. It was about reclamation, about balance. The boy who had been thrown out had returned as a man who now walked back in on his own terms. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need their apology. What I needed was already here, the proof that I had built a life stronger than the one they denied me. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just let the silence settle over me like a cloak. The air in the house felt different now, not suffocating but still. I understood then that revenge doesn't always come with thunder. It sometimes comes with quiet. This was not about punishment, it was about balance. And balance, once restored, does not need applause. It only needs recognition. I had been cast out once, but now, 10 years later, I sat in their house as its owner. And that was enough. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores powerful themes of betrayal, resilience, and unexpected triumph in the face of familial rejection and injustice. This narrative aims to inspire perseverance, challenge assumptions about success, and highlight the enduring spirit of those who overcome adversity.